Welcome back again to another GWT tutorial, and in this tutorial I'll be continuing on the topic of remote procedure calls. And like with my last tutorial, I will start out with a presentation, even though it's a short one this time. So the topic of this tutorial is remote procedure calls with complex data types. So what have we done in the previous tutorial? Well, in the previous tutorial I have discussed what remote procedure calls, or RPC, are. And I've shown a very simple example of making an RPC call to the server side of an application and showing the output of the call on screen. So what am I going to do in this tutorial? Well, in this tutorial I'm going to elaborate on the example that I did in the last tutorial and modify it in such a manner that complex data types, or objects, are returned from the server. This is in line with proper object-oriented practices. In proper object-oriented practices, data is usually handled inside the system in the form of an object and not a single primitive data type or a collection of loosely coupled, or for the most part completely decoupled primitive data types. So how does this work? Well, when I make an RPC call, instead of returning my result as a primitive type, I'm going to return it in the form of an object. And I assume that whoever is watching this video is familiar with Java and object-oriented programming enough to know what an object is. It should be noted though, and that's the whole reason why I'm having this slide, is that not every object by default can be sent from the server to the client. This is because an object needs to be converted to a binary format so it can be sent from the server to the client. You can do this in Google Web Toolkit by implementing the Serializable Interface in every object that you send from the server to the client and vice versa. This also means that objects can only contain attributes which are primitive types, because as you noticed last time when I was returning a primitive type, I did not have to particularly serialize the output of my methods. So the attributes inside my object can only be primitive types or other objects that in turn can be serialized, meaning that they also contain either objects that can be serialized or primitive data types. So in today's example, I'm going to still maintain the last architecture that I discussed in my previous tutorial, which you can see in the picture below. So I have my GUI, I have my client implementation, which is being enforced by a client interface. I have my service and my service async interfaces, and through all of that I'm making an RPC call to the service implementation, which is on the server side. So no changes there, and as a matter of fact in my next tutorial I'll be using this exact same architecture again. The only difference is for this tutorial is that the RPC methods in this case will be returned as objects, and I will ensure in this example that the GUI will respond differently on the objects coming in. So that's pretty much it for my presentation. So let me just close that. So now let's go to Eclipse and take a look at the actual example. So what I've done, this is a project I used last time, GWT Project 3. And in this case I'm going to use GWT Project 3 Part 2, which is an exact copy of the project from the previous tutorial. So all the basic classes are still there that I used last time. The only thing I've added is I've added a images folder under my war folder, because I'll be using this images folder later for this example. So let's open the service and the service async again. So in my last tutorial I defined the three methods: say hello, add two numbers, and say goodnight. In this particular case I'm going to add, well, probably two more methods, because this is an example I'm improvising. And one method is going to return a object that contains some personal information. And the other object is going to return the paths of those two images that I've added. So, in line with proper architecture, let's get the model part out of the way first. So for that, I'm going to create a new package. And this package is going to be named model because it's going to contain my model objects, my data objects. So let's create the first one in this package. And I'm going to start with the personal info object. So finish. And as I mentioned in my PowerPoint presentation just now, if I want to make sure that this object can be sent over the line, I need to make sure that the serializable interface is implemented. And the serializable interface can be imported from the java.io package. So that's that, and that's pretty much all I need to do. If I were to send this object from the server to the client now, or vice versa, it could be perfectly well sent over. It will not give me any error. So all what remains me to do is basically create some attributes that contain my data. So in this case I'm going to contain a private string which is going to contain the name of a person, and a private integer named age, which is going to contain the age of a person. And what else can I add? Because two attributes is kind of dull. I guess I could add a string called gender. Normally I would never store gender as a string, but just for the sake of example. So I want to generate some getters and setters. So since I'm a lazy programmer, I'm going to source and then generate getters and setters. Select all and OK. Saves me a whole lot of typing. So that's pretty much that. So let's now create the other object, and in the other object, which I'm going to name the images list, I guess. And again, I have to implement the serializable interface. So in this particular object I would like several image paths to be stored, and since I kind of want to leave it open-ended how many image paths I'm going to store there, I'm going to store my image paths as a string array called images. And again, same thing as before, I am going to generate some getters and setters. So that's that. That's pretty much my whole model part. So now going to the service and service async implementation. I'm going to create a additional method, and this method is going to return personal and a personal info object, or an instance of personal info object. And naturally I have to import this object. That will probably be done later. Get personal info. And in this case I guess I want to provide a string which is the name of the person. Or to make it more interesting, string family name. So let's see if I can handle the import now. And yes, I can. I still get an error, and if you have seen my previous tutorial you'll know why I'm getting this error, because I've not created this method in the async interface yet. I'll be doing that in a moment, because first I want to add another RPC method which is going to return a instance of images list, get images, and no parameters required in this case. So import images list as well from my model package. Then, well, since I'm a lazy programmer, I'm just going to copy these methods and put them in my async interface. And since asynchronous does not return any data, or at least not straight away, the return types are going to be void. And as you may remember, I need to add a async callback to my methods as well. And as you can see, I'm copying a lot because, as I've mentioned very often, I'm a lazy programmer. So that's pretty much that. Now, just for consistency, and again, let me copy those methods. I'm going to update my service client interface. In this case, I just have to specify the methods and not create a callback, because this interface is just for ensuring that whatever method I am defining on my server side will also be implemented in my client implementation class. As I said, I explained all of this in my previous tutorial. So since I've added two methods here, I'm now getting an error on my example service client implementation, which is actually the error indicating that I forgot about those methods, or I didn't forget about them, I simply have not implemented them yet. So I'm just going to say add unimplemented methods. And just for the tidiness of my code, I'm just going to move them upwards a little bit. I'm going to put them under say goodnight, which was the method of the previous tutorial. And even though I have not implemented my methods on the server side yet, and that's why I'm having this error here, I can already pretend they are already there, and just do a invocation straight away from my client. This.service get personal info, and I need to provide a family name, which is the parameter for this method. So I'm going to provide that one here, and I'm just going to rely on my default callback again. And the same thing for get images. So this.service get images, and no parameter in this case, so I just need to provide a callback, and I'm going to use my default callback in this case. Okay, then that's that for now. I'll deal with the returning data later in the tutorial. Okay, so now moving on to the server-side implementation. And again, I'm getting the error in which Eclipse is reminding me that I've not implemented these methods yet. So I'm just going to implement them, and just to maintain a bit of tidy code, I'm gonna, well, I don't need to shift them up. I can just leave them here. Okay, so now actually we get the part where I need to make sure that this object is actually being returned. Well, let me just start by implementing the getPersonalInfo method. And in this method I sort of want to simulate a bit of a search function in which a family name is provided as a search criteria, and the all the bio data of a person is returned, at least if the family name is found. Typically I would have to interact with a database for that, but for the sake of simplicity in this tutorial I'm not going to do so. So instead I'm just going to create a personal info object, which is the bio data of a person. I'm going to initialize this object properly, and then I'm simply going to fill up some dummy data. So biodata.setName, and I can just provide any name, I guess. Yeah, what shall I make up for this? I guess I could say George Tan. And George Tan in this particular case is 35 years old, perhaps. And as the, sorry, that should not be, I make a mistake here. That should not be get age, but set age. And in this case, set gender, I'm simply going to set to male, because George naturally is a male name. Then finally, I'm simply going to return this biodata object by saying return biodata. So that's pretty much it for my server-side implementation, at least as far as the getPersonalInfo method is concerned. So same thing for the image list. I'm going to create an instance of my images list object, and I'm going to name it image list, and I'm going to initialize it. Well, you may images list. You may remember that I want to set an array of image paths in this particular case. So I'm going to create a string array, which I'm going to call images, and I'm going to initialize it with a length of 2 in this case, because I want to show 2 images. So let's just hard code the paths here. So images index 0 is, and make sure I get this correct. So since this is my top folder and these are the pictures, I'm going to say images, because war folder is the root, so no need to include it. Images. Not sure if I'm getting the slash correctly, but I'll probably see it later whether or not I got it right. So that's the first image. Because I always mix up the slashes. And landscape 2. I'm going to set this string array in the appropriate attribute in the image list object. And finally, like with the getPersonalInfo method, I'm going to return this images object. Oh, sorry, image list object. That's what happens when you're using two names that look very much alike. And that's pretty much it for the server-side implementation of both methods. So both methods are created, they are implemented, and they are now returning a object instead of a primitive type that we used in the previous tutorial. So now going back to the client implementation to make sure that this data is properly handled. You may remember from my previous tutorial that I actually checked for the data type, and based on a certain data type being found, I invoked a method on the GUI. So in this particular case, the default callback receives an object, and if this object named result is an instance of string, I know it's the greeting being returned, and I'm going to update a particular label on my GUI. Same thing for the integer. So since I'm just going to leave these methods for what they are, I'm just going to extend this if-else construction by adding another else-if. And I'm going to say if result is an instance of, and in this case an instance of personal info, I am going to do something. And that's something I'm going to do as well for starters. I'm going to cast my result to that particular object, for which I have to import the object first. Here it is. Personal info, then use a normal standard cast to cast the result to an object of the type personal info. And then I'm going to do something on my GUI, but at this point I can't do anything on my GUI yet, so I'm just going to let it be for now. Instead I'm going to create the second else if and check if this result is perhaps an instance of images list. And import the images list, of course. So if that is the case, I am going to cast this generic result object to an object of the type images list. and then in turn do something on my GUI, but in this particular case there's nothing I can do yet. So for that I have to modify my GUI first, so let's go to my main GUI class. So basically I have my update label here, I had my update sum label, which is over here, and I have my buttons that made something happen. So in this particular case, what I'm going to do is basically I'm going to display the information that I received well, I guess I'm gonna display the personal info inside the HTML widget, and I'm going to show the images in some sort of panel. And in this particular case, I'm just gonna take the very easy way out. I'm gonna add all these widgets to my vertical panel, which I use to basically contain all the stuff. So, and the only thing I'm gonna do, just for sake of example, I'm going to reuse these buttons. No, actually, I think I'll do the extra effort. I think I'll just implement 2 new buttons. So let me just do that very quickly, just to make sure the tutorial is a bit more clear. So I'm going to call this the biodata button. And this button is added to the vertical panel. And I'm going to create another button, calling images button. Okay, and naturally I need to implement a click handler for this, and in case of the biodata button, I guess I also need to provide a name. So I'm just going to create an additional text box, family name text equals new text box. So I'm also going to add this one to the vertical panel. This is probably going to make my GUI look terribly ugly, but it's just for the sake of example. So I need to have a click handler for every button, and just to speed things up, because I've demonstrated this a few times, I'm just going to shamelessly copy a previous click handler and just change the name. So I'm going to call this one biodata click handler, and call this the images click handler. And what do these click handlers do? Well, in case of the biodata click handler, I am going to retrieve a string called family name from my family name text box using the getText method, which I of course will have to declare globally. So let's just do that first. I need to declare this globally because else I can't access it from inside my click handler. So that's that. So now no more error here. And then what I'm going to do with this family name, I am going to go to my service implementation client implementation class, and I'm going to invoke the getPersonalInfo method, providing the family name as the input parameter. So now the RPC call is being made. For the images click handler, I don't need to retrieve any data. The only thing I have to do is I have to use my client implementation class to say get images, and then basically the images should be returned to me. So last thing to do is I am going to add these click handlers to my newly created buttons. So this would be new bio data click handler. And this would be new images click handler. Okay, and now I need to have a method, and that's actually why I went to this class, to actually handle my data. So in this particular case, I'm just going to create a method here, public void, and what will happen here? Public void display personal info. And this personal info is going to require this object, a personal info object. And naturally I have to import this. For the images, I'm also going to create a method, public class display images, which in this particular case is going to contain a images list object, or going to receive an images list object. Oh, sorry, this is not public class, it's public void. Okay, I'm gonna leave the actual code for these methods for what it is. First I'm gonna go back to my client implementation just to wrap things up. So now I have a method available in my GUI which can receive the information, and suppose we process it, or it will be able to process it in a moment. All that I need is left for me to do in the client implementation is say main GUI. In this particular case, display personal info, providing this personal info object as the input, and in case of the images list, I'm simply going to call it display images with the list as the input parameter. So that's done. If all goes well, and we'll find out in a bit, I should not be having to modify the class anymore. So first let's do something with the personal info. And like I said, I'm going to pick the easy way out on this one. So I'm just going to create a HTML object or HTML widget just for displaying the data in a very rough format. Then I'm going to create a string, and typically in a real example what I would do is I would have a different label for every piece of information and display this information in each label. But like I said, for the sake of example, because this example is about RPC and not about GUI building, I'm going to basically put all the information in a HTML structure. So in this case, I'm going to create a string code which is going to contain, and I'm going to use HTML formatting here, a name label which is going to contain plus, which is going to display itself plus the actual name of the person. Then followed by a break. And if you're familiar with HTML, you'll know that this is basically the HTML equivalent of an enter. Then I'm going to extend this code string a bit further by adding a label named age, containing the info.getAge information, and again another break. Finally, I'm going to display the gender. And let's just put age with a capital letter as well. Plus info dot get gender. Naturally, this should be between double quotes. So So that should be that. And I'm going to say HTML dot set HTML using the string code. And finally I'm going to add this HTML widget to my vertical panel. And then by right this should all display. Okay, now as for implementing the images, first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to get that images array from the images object. So string array images list equals images dot get images, which as you can see is returning a string array. Then to successfully display all these images, I first need to create a for loop to loop through this array. So for integer I equals 0, while I is smaller than images list dot length increase I with 1 every loop, so I++. Then inside this loop I'm going to create a image widget named aImage is new image, and let me just import it first. And then basically set the image path under that particular index in the array as the image path. So I'm going to use the counter I to basically set the image path, then add this image to my vertical panel as well. So by right I should see multiple images appear. The number of images that should appear are equal to the length of the array, which I've hard-coded to 2 in this particular case. And well, if I didn't forget anything, things should be working now. So let's give it a try. No guarantee it will work, but well, we can at least try at this point. My console is in the weirdest location, but never mind. So let's just paste and go. Okay, so let's first try and retrieve the bio data. So in this particular case, well, we're going to search for Tan as the family name and then say get bio data. And as you can see, George Tan, age 35, gender male, is being returned from the server and being displayed in HTML format. So now let's try the same thing for the images. And that's our first image. Or in this case, that's our second image. In this particular case, I did not set the width for the images. So let's just go back there for a moment. So I'm going to say aImage dot set width, and I'm going to set it to 600 pixels. So let's make this one a bit smaller and just restart the application again. So again, I'm going to search for George, and that is being returned. And I'm going to say get images, and now the images are displayed in a smaller size. So it seems to be working, and since I took such a flimsy way of displaying the information being returned, if I were to press it again, it will simply be added to the bottom again. But anyway, like I said, this tutorial is about RPC and not about GUI building. I'll be taking a closer look into GUI building in relationship to this RPC in my next tutorial. So code-wise we're done. Just to wrap it up, let me use my debug mode to step through once more, just to show you all what is happening here. So I'm going to add a breakpoint inside my click handlers, my get images click handler and my biodata click handler, and I'm going to add a breakpoint inside my display personal info method and inside display images. Finally, I'm going to add a breakpoint inside both these methods on the server side, just so it stops at the appropriate moments where things are actually worth seeing. So now let's run this in debug mode. Okay, so again we are going to search for George and get bio data. So being in debug mode, we now stopped at this line. So if I now step over, you'll see that the name George is being retrieved from the family name text field. And on the next line, I'm actually going to use my client implementation class to invoke the get personal info method. So let's just step into that method for a moment. And that's my plugin saying that he's unresponsive, so I don't want to stop it because I'm still talking. So here we are in the client implementation class. As you can see, George is provided as a parameter, and I'm going to actually, in this particular line, going to invoke the actual server with George as the parameter. So just continue. So now we're on the server side in the service implementation class, in which I'm creating an object, and the object you can actually see here called biodata. I'm setting the values of this object, George Tan, 35 and male respectively, and then I'm simply returning this whole object, which brings me to the, well, I just jumped over it, but should actually bring us here, and you'll see it on the next round. After which the display personal info method is being invoked. My HTML is created and the data is displayed on screen. Okay, let's do the same thing for get images. So again, after get images is clicked, I end up on my images click handler, after which I will step into the method, end up in the client implementation class, in which the get images method is invoked, after which the get images method on the client implementation is going to invoke the equivalent method under Serverside Implementation, and there's that plugin again. So let's just let it wait for a while because I'm still talking. Then resume, so we end up on the server side now, after which the images list object is created. Doesn't contain anything yet. So first I'm going to create my images array, which is being set to 2 image paths, after which that array is set in the images attribute of the images list, after which the whole object is being returned. Then we again end up in the default click handler, default callback in the client implementation class, after which, well, the object result will be compared, so it's not a string, it's not an integer, it's not a personal object, personal info object, but it is an images list. After which the cast is done and the display, okay, one last time I hope. That's what happens if you stop your program for long periods of time. Anyway, let's just continue. After which I'm going to invoke display images on the GUI, which will ensure we end up here. After which we go through the for loop, create 2 images added to the vertical panel, after which the images appear. So that's pretty much RPC with objects, complex data types or objects. Not much different than regular RPC. So I don't think this tutorial was too difficult. And basically in my next tutorial I'll be putting the RPC part with the proper GUI architecture part together and see how we can build a whole application in a proper manner. So let me just go back to my G2E view and stop the program. close my Eclipse, close my Chrome, and say goodbye for now.